Opportunities in the Marketplace by Victor Yap and Doris Mock. Chapter 12. Solomon. Wise men still find him. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 to 28. What do sages and philosophers have to say about wisdom? Philosopher Cicero. The function of wisdom is to discriminate between good and evil. The philosopher Immanuel Kant. Science is organized knowledge. Wisdom is organized life. Socrates. The only true wisdom is in knowing you, knowing nothing. Other sayings on wisdom by achievers of all sorts include Robert Greene Ingersoll. It is 1,000 times better to have common sense without education than to have education without common sense. Sam Levinson. It is so simple to be wise. Just think of something stupid to say and say the opposite. Theodore Roosevelt. 9/10 of wisdom consists in being wise in time. Anonymous. Age doesn't always bring wisdom. Sometimes age comes alone. The new King Solomon took office by stating his devotion to God in the most dramatic fashion. He sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings, verse 4, to express his devotion and thanksgiving to God. The sacrifices were continuous, extraordinary, and spectacular. It was close to a 3 years sacrifice for a commoner offering a sacrifice a day. The flames blazed in intensity, the smoke filled the temple, and the aroma pleased the Lord. In a night dream, God gave Solomon a blank check. Ask for whatever you want me to give you, verse 5. What would you want if you were given your heart's desire? Would you want gold, glory, greatness? Do you desire fame and fortune, power and prosperity, or longevity and looks? The answer is none of the above for Solomon, who asked for wisdom. What is wisdom? What makes a person wise beyond his age, background, and circumstances? What separates him from others? First, wisdom is comprehension. Understand past conditions. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 to 9. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" General Colin Powell had risen to the top in all his professions. He occupied the nation's highest military position as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was the U.S. Secretary of State in George W. Bush's administration, but Powell started from the very bottom. He learned a valuable lesson as a young man mopping floors at a local soft drink bottling plant. His belief was, no matter what you do, someone is always watching. Powell recalled his early working experience. "I set out to be the best mop wielder there ever was. One day someone left 50 cases of cola crash to the concrete and Brown's sticky foam cascaded across the floor. It was almost more than I could bear. But I kept mopping, right to left, left to right. At summer's end, the foreman said, 'You mop floors pretty good.' The next summer, he had me filling bottles. The third summer, I was deputy foreman. As I have learned, someone is always watching." Solomon wisely appreciated all that was handed to him. He began by praising God for his faithfulness and remembering his great mercy to David, his father. There are 247 occurrences of the Hebrew word mercy, or hesed, but only 4 references to his great mercy, Gadol Hesed, are recorded in the Bible. Twice in verse 6 of Solomon's prayer, and once in the corresponding 2 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 8 version. The verse 6 phrases great mercy and great kindness are identical in Hebrew. The only other mention of God's great mercy outside of Solomon's prayer is from David's psalm in 145 verse 8, extolling God's mercy, paraphrased as rich in love by NIV. So, all 4 scriptural references to God's great mercy were related to David's life and reign. The enthroned king rightly recognized God had shown great mercy only to his father and none other. David, as readers know, at his best was probably deserving of praise, honor, and mercy, but not great mercy. The great mercy afforded David was not only unprecedented, but also unmerited and unmatched. One of the reasons for Solomon's ascension was that he, more than any of his ambitious brothers, was the only potential candidate that understood his father's unique role in history and extraordinary relationship with God. By extension, he cared more for his father than his fortune, was more concerned for the king than for his kingdom, and understood his great legacy was more than good luck. Also, unlike his brothers, Solomon did not eye his father's throne, deem his father dead, and usurp his father's power. Solomon was a man of extraordinary rhetoric and elegant praise. To further praise God, he called the people God had raised thy people, verse 8 and 9, a great people, verse 8, and so great a people, verse 9 in King James Version. This word great, verse 8, is different from the word great, describing God's great mercy, verse 6. The great in verse 6 has to do with supremacy. The verse 8, great, has to do with quantity of the people, and the verse 9, great, has to do with majesty or glory, from the Hebrew word chabod. In humility, Solomon thrice considered himself God's servant, thy servant, verses 7, 8, and 9, a vessel for God's use on earth. The last king to call himself as such. Such humbling vocabulary was missing from the kings that succeeded Solomon. Thus, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Second, wisdom is conditional. Make personal choices. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 10 to 15. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. Famed tenor Luciano Pavarotti told of the choices he made as a young man and the slow progress he made in his field. When I was a boy, my father, a baker, introduced me to the wonders of song. He urged me to work very hard to develop my voice. Arrigo Pola, a professional tenor in my hometown of Modena, Italy, took me as a pupil. I also enrolled in a teacher's college. On graduating, I asked my father, "Shall I be a teacher or a singer?" "Luciano," my father replied, "if you try to sit on two chairs, you will fall between them. For life, you must choose one chair." I chose one. It took 7 years of study and frustration before I made my first professional appearance. It took another 7 to reach the Metropolitan Opera. And now I think whether it's laying bricks, writing a book, whatever we choose, we should give ourselves to it. Commitment, that's the key. Choose one chair. Readers might be surprised to know discernment, verses 9, 11, 12, and 21, overshadows wisdom, verses 12 and 28 in the chapter. Solomon's request for discernment, verse 11, was unusual of a commoner or a king. Kings ask for greatness, glory, or gold. Solomon's Hebrew word choice of discernment was the discernment manifested in individuals such as Joseph, Genesis 41, 33 and 39, Eli, 1 Samuel 3 verse 8, his father David, 1 Samuel 16 verse 18, but God gave him more. God made him not only discerning, but wise and discerning, verse 12. God gave him the best model possible, the example of Joseph, who rose to the top and took charge of everything in Egypt. The dual words discerning and wise apply only to Solomon and Joseph. Genesis 41, 33, and 39, not even to David. Joseph spoke wisdom, commanded respect, and governed millions. God gave Solomon also more things, including riches and honor, verse 13, than he could imagine when he wisely chose discernment in administering justice. However, there is a limit to what God gives. The free ride stops at the door of the heart. God cannot pour willingness, faithfulness, and obedience into a person. That will have to come from a man's heart. God, in all his wisdom, still make relationship with him, and submitting to him a question of choice, an option to take, and a decision to make. At best, Solomon was an obedient son who walked according to the statutes of his father, verse 3. That was a good start and a big step, but not an end by itself. It's been said, God has no grandchildren. God is our Father, not our grandfather. He has only sons and daughters, no grandchildren. Everyone has to come to personal faith and choose God for oneself. One can be born into a pious family on earth, but one cannot be forced into a personal relationship with God. Faith is guided and not given. It is teachable but not transferable. Lawrence J. Peter mused, "Going to church does not make you a Christian any more than going to the garage makes you a car." God's requirement for Solomon was to follow my ways, my statutes, and my commands, verse 14. God left the door open and invited the young king to take the direction his father took, but he did not push him in, slam the door, and throw the key. The most God could do for Solomon was to walk him in and not carry him in. Third, wisdom is concrete. Read present circumstances. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 to 27. Now, 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." So they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says, 'My son is alive and your son is dead,' while that one says, 'No, your son is dead and mine is alive.'" Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, "Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Then the king gave his ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." The Americans and Japanese decided to engage in a boat race. Both teams practiced hard and long to reach their peak performance levels. On the big day, they felt ready. The Japanese won by a mile. The American team was discouraged by the loss. Morale sagged. Corporate management decided that the reason for the crushing defeat had to be found. So a consulting firm was hired to investigate the problem and recommend corrective action. The consultant's finding: the Japanese team had 8 people rowing and 1 person steering. The American team had 1 person rowing and 8 people steering. After a year of study and millions spent analyzing the problem, the consultant firm concluded that too many people were steering and not enough were rowing on the American team. So, as race day neared again the following year, the Americans' team management structure was completely reorganized. The new structure: 4 steering managers, 3 area steering managers, and a new performance review system for the person rowing the boat to provide work incentive. The next year, the Japanese won by 2 miles. Humiliated, the American corporation laid off the rower for poor performance and gave the managers a bonus for discovering the problem. Wisdom that cannot be applied is worthless. At first sight, Solomon's decision seemed to be pure magic. Wisdom, however, is not about pulling a rabbit out of a hat or conjuring a trick out of thin air. It is about making sound and not snappy decisions, to be thorough thinking and not trigger happy. Wisdom is not about information or instinct, but about investigation, insight, and integration. A wise person is attentive to details, patient in learning, and slow in deliberation. Solomon carefully listened to both sides, not one side of the story, before deciding. He studied people's body language, observed human interaction, and examined personal feelings to his advantage. The wise king did not allow his heart to rule his head or colored his judgment, be the woman harlot or otherwise. Verse 17. Instead, he scrutinized all involved, covered the angles, and exposed any weaknesses, listening not only to the words that mouth it, but the heart that spoke it. He took his time, dissected the problem, and judged the intent. The biggest myth about wisdom is that it is dreamlike and surreal. Dreams are made for the night, but wisdom is for the day. Biblical wisdom is not stored in the mind, but shown in the act. Wisdom is practical, not philosophical or polemical. It is timely and not theoretical, and it is realistic and not idealistic. Wisdom is action and not abstract, sensible and not scholarly, not learned but lived, teachable and not just talk, applicable and not just academic. Of course, Solomon was not about to divide the child in two, but he was not beyond using tests, tricks, and teasers to get the right result, including the debut of the verb cut, verse 25 in the Bible, and find the real mother, verse 27, the one who would rather save, share, and spare the baby than to spit, sever, and sacrifice the baby. The verbs bring, verse 24, cut, and give, verse 25, are imperatives. Mothers are angels and never monsters to their own child, givers and healers, never killers and haters of their own. Fear of the King Solomon, verse 28, made a fascinating comeback in Solomon's story, 1 Kings 1:51. Conclusion. Have you done the wisest thing in life? To accept Christ for oneself. Jesus is the only person who was filled with wisdom, Luke 2:40, and growing in wisdom, Luke 2:52. Do you fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom and not an end in itself? Wisdom has to be continually sought and is not permanently caught. Do you make wise choices, choose wise company, and seek wise counsel? Bible study questions. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 to 28. 1. How does the scripture describe Solomon's love for the Lord? Verses 3 to 4. 2. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a night dream. What grace did the Lord give him? Verse 5. 3. Solomon's response to the Lord shows, verse 6 to 10, his view on his father David, his view of the Lord, his view on the throne, his view of himself, his view of the Israelites. 4. What did Solomon ask for the Lord in the end? Verse 9. 5. Why was God pleased with Solomon's request? Verse 10 to 11. Contrast the difference between just ask for wisdom to listen to lawsuits and long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies. 6. Analyze God's provision, verses 12 to 14. A. What Solomon requested, verse 12. B. What Solomon did not request, verse 13. C. Other conditions in the promises, verse 14. 7. Wisdom and listening. A. What was the appeal of the two prostitutes before the king, verses 17 to 22. B. What were they fighting for? Verse 22. C. What did Solomon command? Verse 23 to 25. Was he really going to cut apart an infant who was living? D. Did the child's biological mother react the same way as the other woman? Why? E. What was the final judgment of the king? Verses 27 to 28. F. What did the Israelites perceive from this judgment? Verse 28. G. What was the difference between deciding on God's wisdom and deciding on your own wisdom? Group sharing. 1. What is the difference between human wisdom and the wisdom of God in your heart? 2. What kind of wisdom do you need in the workplace today? 3. In the workplace where you are currently working, what would you ask for yourself from God? Why? Are these for your personal benefit, and are they God-centered? As with Solomon's response, what does this reveal about how you relate to God, work, yourself, and others? 4. How has this lesson helped you as a disciple of Christ to understand your role, identity, participation, influence, and relationship with others in the marketplace? Personal application. 1. Write down the grace and blessings God has already given you at work. 2. Write down the prayers in your heart to entrust to God and ask Him to teach you more clearly what you desired and requested, and to be more God-centered. 3. Have you experienced the wisdom given by God in your work? How does this experience affect you? 4. Do others see God's blessing and grace in you? Why? 5. What difficulties do you presently face to seek for God's wisdom? Pray for this.